prior to taking this job, I was an associate professor of psychology at Simmons University in Boston. Um, I started out on my path as kind of your regular researcher. Part of my story is I was a first generation college student. I started college thinking that I was going to be pre-med and took chemistry and sorry about that. Took chemistry and calculus and got D's in those courses and determined that maybe I wasn't going to be a medical doctor. And it was during that time that Dr. Mickey Hebel at Rice University invited me into her research lab. And that's when I learned about, getting a PhD and becoming an academic and a researcher and a professor. And I got on that track and continued on that track. I did my graduate work at Tufts University, which is right outside of Boston, with Keith Maddox, and was never the typical grad student. I was always trying to find something else to dig into. So even as a grad student, I was working in the Office of Institutional Diversity at Tufts. I was the research assistant for their first senior diversity officer. I was doing recruitment and retention efforts with the grad school to diversify the classes of graduate graduate students that were coming in. I was working at the Africana Center and being a consultant for them and doing some programming for them. So when it came time to go on to, sorry about that, when it came time to go on to the job market, I just went for what I could find. And I had been told up until that point that the pathway of success, once you got a PhD, was for you to go and become a professor and become tenured and be promoted to full professor and live that academic life. So I lived that out and tried my best to, just be a researcher that didn't dabble in other things. But I was never able to do that. I was never fully satisfied with that work. I wanted to figure out a way that I could branch the research into policy and make, lasting and meaningful change within higher education, within my students' lives, etc. So I went up for tenure and promotion. I became a tenured professor, and some of you might laugh at this if you were a tenured professor, but I got my tenure decision and went on the job market. And that's how I ended up at Allegheny as their Dean for Institutional Diversity. And in this role, I am the Senior Diversity Officer for the college. I am in charge with policy and strategy around diversity, equity, inclusion, and access for all students and also employees. So it's a very big job, but it's a job that I feel has a lasting impact on policy in a way that I could not do just within the classroom. That said, I still dabble, I still do research, I'm still writing and doing less empirical work and more reviews and policy work. So looking at the implications of social psychological work on current policy. So right now I'm actually working on a paper looking at the implications of social psychological research for COVID-19 and looking beyond just the direct impact of COVID-19 to what are the lasting impacts on marginalized and minoritized communities when it comes to stereotyping and prejudice. And here in the US, I'm sure many of you have seen, our president often refers to COVID-19 as the China virus, and the impact of that type of labeling in a highly politicized context on Asian and Asian Americans. The history of medical racism within the US and how that might impact, in particular, Black individuals when a vaccine is available, who will be willing to take said vaccine, given the long, complicated history of medical racism. So yes, I've always just tried to look at ways in which I could take the foundations of social psychology that I learned and apply them in ways to better understand policy and really correct inequities. So that's a kind of long intro into where I am now. So what I'm hoping to share with you today is some research I did actually At this point, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the paper itself was published in December of 2017. However, it is still highly relevant now on Black racial group stereotypes in victim blaming. And I'm going to just start with a little overview of what direction I plan to go. So oh, went too many slides. So I wanted to start out by talking about Say Her Name and the Say Her Name movement and kind of the real world experience of Black women in the US, and then tie in kind of a global context. Then I was hoping to share with you the study in particular that I looked at how presenting stereotypic information about a victim then impacts how that victim is perceived, how the perpetrator or the shooter, the killer in the instance is perceived, and how that might impact criminal proceedings. So basically, how is the information that the public receives from the media about a victim, how does that then impact their empathy and sympathy with the victim, the way in which they perceive a killer? In this case, it was a shooting incident. And then also how that then impacts indictment recommendations. And then I want to open it up for Q&A. I really hope to keep this pretty informal. Unfortunately, I'll have to figure out how I can see the raise hand function as I'm sharing my screen. But if you have questions along the way, we can always stop. I'll just have to figure out how to do that. So I want to start with almost a shameless plug about a journal issue that I co-edited some years back in the Journal of Social Issues. My collaborator, Kim Khan, who is an associate professor of psychology at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, here in the US, she and I co-edited a volume of the Journal of Social Issues on police violence against racial and ethnic minorities that came out back in 2017. What's interesting about this project is Kim and I actually started working on it right after Trayvon Martin's death. And in the process of getting the issue together and getting it out, there were so many more deaths of Black and Brown people globally that this issue expanded into something much bigger. So I'm going to click on this link here that takes you directly to the Journal of Social Issues website. For now, my issue of the Journal of Social Issues on racial and ethnic, police violence against racial and ethnic minorities is actually free access. So I'll share this presentation with you so that you can go directly to the issue and see more information that you might be interested in. But just so you know, there are a range of contributors, and we looked at a range of different types of data. So historical data of police shootings within Department of Justice data here in the US from 1980 to 2000 to look at different trends. We looked at impact of the neighborhood, what the person was wearing in decisions to shoot someone, so shooter bias research. We looked at disparities in lethal use of force between police officers. So the likelihood of an off-duty police officer being killed by another police officer in plain clothing. And then we continued on and looked at even the impact of discrimination on adolescents in school districts in a global context, in a European context. We looked at trauma over time. So if you have an opportunity, I would highly encourage you to take a look at the journal issue and the articles that are provided. So I mentioned that I was never quite the typical graduate student. Well, I wasn't the typical undergraduate student either. I was always interested in the research that I thought would help me better understand my lived experience. And this goes all the way back to when I was a high school student. So when I was a college student, I had a professor say to me, at some point you're going to have to make a decision about who you want to be as a researcher. Are you going to be labeled the Black woman that studies Black things? And I took that to heart. I heard what he said, and I said, yep, I guess I am. So my kind of pathway has always been research is me search. And this is where Say Her Name comes into play. So for those of you who are not familiar with Say Her Name is a specific movement that brings awareness to the often invisible names and stories of Black women and girls who are victimized by police violence. Um, I think most people are familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement, but less information is out there about Say Her Name. And there's a reason why. So some of the work that I do on intersectionality, so the intersections of different identities, suggests that Black women are often invisible because they're intersecting multiple minoritized identities. So the identity of being Black and the identity of being woman, those two identities together render Black women in particular less visible when it comes to policy, when it comes to healthcare related items, when it comes to the things that rise to the level of people's attention. And from a social psychological perspective and a social cognition perspective, what we know is that people have prototypes of who they consider to be the typical person that represents a particular category. So if we say Blacks in particular, more people bring to mind Black men than Black women. And at least in the US context, when people say women or the struggle for feminism or women's rights and equity and gender, the person that they really have in mind is a white woman. So when we get at issues of racism and sexism that intersect in this way, it's highly possible, and there's historical context to support this, that the cause of Black women gets lost in the shuffle. And Say Her Name is an explicit effort to right that wrong. And I bring up Say Her Name because of a murder that happened in the US recently, the murder of Breonna Taylor. And many of you have maybe heard of Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old Black woman who was asleep in her Louisville, Kentucky apartment when three officers intruded with a no-knock warrant on the night of March 13th, 2020. A no-knock warrant means that the police officers do not necessarily announce themselves, and they may be plain clothed. So as she was sleeping with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, police officers barged into her house. Her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, thought that the police officers were intruders and fired a warning shot. There's some debate about if the shot he fired injured one of the officers, but the narrative that's out there now is that the shot he fired injured an officer, and because of that, officers returned fire. The three officers involved blindly shot at least 25 times into Breonna Taylor's apartment. 8 of those shots fatally wounded Breonna Taylor. Initially, there was really no word about this case. Another example of Say Her Name. Many people around the world knew the names George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, some others that were killed in police violence, in other forms of violence, Black and brown bodies killed, but the story of Breonna Taylor still went untold. So when Breonna Taylor's murder did come to the forefront and people began to talk about it, what interests me was the ways in which Breonna Taylor was portrayed in the media. So you'll see this image of her here. If you do a Google search of Breonna Taylor, this is the image that typically comes up. It's her receiving an award. I think she was graduating from some type of medical training program there. But you'll notice that this is a very professional, in quotes, photograph of Breonna Taylor. If you go to Google her name now, the things that come up about her are her family members talking about how caring she was of an individual, that she was an award-winning first responder. There was a lot of honor put on her name. And to me, it felt like a concerted effort by media and by her family to present her in the most positive light possible. And I realized that this is a pattern that I'd seen before. I've seen this pattern with other Black and Brown people that have been murdered, within the last 5 years, where the media narrative about them is either highly positive or highly negative. Unfortunately, what we usually see is the negative information about a victim like Breonna Taylor, the information that, in my opinion, helps to justify their murders. So if we go back to the death of Trayvon Martin, some of the initial information we received about Trayvon Martin as we dug into his life was that he had been suspended from school. They released a toxicology report suggesting that he had THC or marijuana in his system, all things that had nothing to do with his murder that night. We saw the same thing happen with Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in the US. And I can go on and on and on, but there's this deluge of information that seems completely irrelevant to the fact that a precious life is gone. So that thinking is actually where the study I'm presenting to you comes from. This question of how might the type of information that media presents about a victim impact the court of public opinion? So how people see and view and feel about the victim, how people see and view and feel about the perpetrator, and then the downstream consequences of that. So what happens with this information when it comes to a grand jury and prosecutors' decisions to take up a particular case or seek a particular indictment? So I'm going to stop here for a moment and stop share to see if there are any questions, because I recognize that I can't see everyone with the current format. So are there any questions so far?
I told the people they could ask a question in the chat or ask you directly.
Okay.
So far, if there is any question, I'll let you know, because I have the two screens.
Thank you. So yeah, you just pop in and let me know. So on to the study. So in the study itself, my collaborator and I, in this case, it was Dr. Sarah Gaither, who is now an assistant professor of psychology at Duke University. She and I turned to Amazon MTurk, to recruit participants for a study on jury decision-making. That's what we told them. I have some information about who we were able to recruit. We initially recruited, I believe, 475 participants. However, 22 of them did not make it into the final analysis because they failed key manipulation checks in the study. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those manipulation checks were in a moment. We had a interesting age range, as you can see. Majority white, majority male, about 50-50 participants. All of the participants were bound to the US so that we could control for context in this particular study. So the participants were randomly assigned to a victim information by race of victim by race of shooter between subjects design. And I'm going to walk through what all of that means. So basically in the study, participants were told, hey, we're doing the study on jury decision making. We're going to present some information about an incident to you. And this was the incident. The incident scenario described a situation where the victim and the shooter were involved in a minor traffic accident. They pulled over into a parking lot. The two of them tried to exchange insurance information, but something escalated within the conversation and a physical altercation started. And then ultimately, the shooter in this case shot the victim several times and fatally wounded him, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Then we get into the witness information. The witness information, there are varying accounts about who was the aggressor in the situation. Ultimately, the shooter said that he thought that the victim had a gun, but upon police investigation, it was determined that there was no gun. So this is the initial scenario that all participants in the study received. What we manipulated was the race of the victim and the race of the shooter, and we did that by name. And actually explicit race. So we gave them different names and also explicitly listed the race of the shooter and the race of the victim. And these were considered key manipulation checks that participants had to show they were actually paying attention to this information that they were presented. And for those people that could not identify the race of the victim and the race of the shooter, their data was not used in the final analyses. So this is the scenario that participants were given. And right after they were given the scenario, we gave them a list of questions where we asked them to tell us basically empathy and sympathy with the victim and the shooter in the case. So if it were me, I would behave similarly. I understand the behaviors of the victim and the shooter. We also asked them to assign fault and blame. So through percentage, how much to blame is the victim, how much to blame is the shooter in the incident. And then finally, we asked them for some indictment recommendations that you would see in the US criminal justice system. So if you were a grand jury member, would you support an indictment of justified homicide, of manslaughter, either voluntary or involuntary, of first-degree murder or second-degree murder? And we provided details of what each one of those indictments meant so that participants had an understanding of what they were actually charging the shooter with if they went forward with a particular indictment recommendation. So in a second step, we then provided the participants with more information about the victim. And we told them this is typical to what you would see in any criminal proceeding, that, you know, there's media coverage of these types of stories. You get information about a family, about the victim, about the shooter. And here's some information about the victim. That information about the victim was either full of negative or stereotype consistent information about stereotypes of Blacks in the US, particularly Black men, or it was positive or counter-stereotypic information. So this is the negative stereotypic biography that we presented the participants with. I'll give you an opportunity to read a little bit, but the victim's name was put in there along with the victim's race to bolster the manipulation again. And then you'll see sprinkled throughout the description are negative stereotypes of Black Americans. So product of a broken home, in this case, raised by a grandmother in a housing project, which gets at this stereotype that Blacks in the US are from lower socioeconomic status and live in less well-off or affluent neighborhoods. That his parents were in and out of jail for dealing drugs. So this gets at criminal activity, and the stereotype that Blacks are associated with criminal activity in the US, that he was uneducated, so he was a high school dropout, that he had his own problems with the law, that he had been in jail, that the day of the particular incident, he was actually playing basketball in a neighborhood basketball court, that he had been described as aggressive by family and friends and previous employers. Lots of information about the victim that is consistent with negative stereotypes of Black Americans, but not information that was relevant to the actual shooting incident. And that's what's important here. And again, this is similar to some of the info that you might see about other folks. So I think of the case of Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice was a 12-year-old Black boy who was playing in a park with a replica gun. It was a toy gun. someone called 911 and said, there's a kid outside with a gun. I'm pretty sure it's a toy gun, but someone should check it out. 2 officers arrived on the scene, and within 20 seconds of arriving on the scene, had opened fire on Tamir Rice, killing him. The next day and the following weeks, the information that came out about Tamir Rice, nothing to do with the shooting itself, was all about his family and their struggles, that his mother had pending drug possession charges, that his family had been on public assistance or welfare. Again, lots of information about Tamir Rice, little about the officers involved or about the shooting itself. So that's the negative information. So either participants saw the negative information about a victim or they saw the positive information about the victim. And the positive information about a victim was, again, counter-stereotypic information about Black Americans. So he grew up in a middle-class suburb, so an affluent house. His parents were well off, you would say middle class in the US. They have a tradition of supporting the arts. So this gets at a counter stereotype of the type of music that Black individuals listen to in the US, that he was a bio major in college, that he worked for the college newspaper, just filled with information, again, not relevant to the shooting itself, but that paints the victim in a particular way. So after participants received that information, they were then asked to complete the questions to assess empathy and sympathy with the victim and shooter again, to assess who was blameworthy in the instance, and then also the indictment recommendations. And the findings that I'm going to share with you are based on that post-information assessment. So what I'm going to start out with is attributions of fault for the victim and attributions of fault for the shooter as a function of victim information. And in this graph, we're looking at across the y-axis, or up the y-axis, participants' ratings of 1 to 7, 1 being not at all at fault or blameworthy, and 7 being very much at fault and blameworthy. For the victim on the left side of the screen and the shooter on the right side of the screen. The bars are represent the type of victim information provided. So the white bars are negative information and the gray bars are positive information about the victim. And what you find in both cases, if we look at fault for the victim and fault for the shooter, a significant impact on the type of information released about the victim on perceptions and attributions of fault in blame. So for the victim, when negative information was presented about the victim, they were more likely to be blamed, or there was more fault and blame assigned to them or attributed to them than when positive information about the victim was presented. Similarly, with the flip, for the shooter, when there was positive information presented about the victim, participants were more likely to blame the shooter, versus when there was negative information presented about the victim, they were less likely to, not less likely, but attributed less fault to the shooter. If we take a look at levels of empathy, sympathy, and then I would behave similarly with the victim or the shooter. So again, empathy, so I would act like this person. We again have the participant ratings of 1 to 7, 1 being I would not, so less likely to sympathize, empathize, or behave like the victim or the shooter in the situation, to 7 being I would very much so, or the most. Again, I have the setup of victim on the left and shooter on the right. In this case, each one of these effects is statistically significant. What we see is with sympathy, again, the same pattern that we saw before, more sympathy with the victim when there was positive information, more sympathy with the victim when there was empathy when there was positive information about the victim, and more sympathy or empathy with the victim, so behaving similarly to the victim when there was positive information presented, in comparison to negative victim information presented, or stereotypic information presented. And again, the same pattern of results flipped for the shooter, where participants were expressing more sympathy and more empathy and saying that they would behave more similarly with the shooter when there was negative information presented about a victim versus positive information presented about the victim. So again, two situations showing that the type of information that is provided about the victim after the fact has some type of impact on the court of public opinion. So the empathy and sympathy that they have with the shooter in the victim in the case, as well as how they attribute fault and blame. And the final finding or final graph I'm going to share with you actually gets at the indictment recommendation. So same thing here. Would you support a particular indictment with 1 being not very much and 7 being very much so? So, or strongly agree. I think it was strongly disagree to strongly agree in this case. The white bars are negative victim information again, and the gray bars are positive stereotypic, counter-stereotypic information about the victim. And there is an interesting and similar pattern of results with indictment recommendations. So for first and second degree murder, participants were less likely to provide an indictment or support for first degree or second degree murder when there was negative information presented about a victim versus positive information presented about a victim. And then again, with justifiable homicide, so this is basically, you were justified in the actions that you did this night. Justifiable homicide was supported more so when negative information about a victim was presented versus positive information about a victim. So this right here just shows you the overall impact of the stereotype information to begin with. These findings hold regardless of the shooter or the race of the shooter or the race of the victim, which I find is really interesting, that you can have a situation where you could paint a white victim with negative racial stereotypes, Black racial group stereotypes, and still see the same pattern of results. I think it just shows the power that these stereotypes have. But there were also some really interesting interactions that happened when it came to shooter race and victim race. And what we found was when there was a white shooter and a Black victim, there was a process where participants were less likely to give recommendations of first degree murder and second degree murder, and more likely to give a recommendation of justifiable homicide. So that also suggests that underlying this victim information effect, there is still some type of racist ideology or thinking working in the ways in which people are justifying murders. So I am gonna stop again to take questions because we're at a point where you might have some questions about the data.
Yeah, sorry, could you go back 2 slides, please? I just had a question. I was wondering whether whether the judgment of 1 slide back still. Yeah. Well, so what we're seeing here in the bars of the shooter is this. We are still looking at the sympathy we have with the victim depending on how the shooter is stereotyped, or are we looking at
it was only information about the victim. So no additional information was presented about the shooter, just the victim. So what you're seeing in this effect is negative information about the victim increases sympathy for the shooter.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, that makes sense. Okay.
And the same thing with empathy and behaving similarly.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a very common way of presenting or defending anyone in court as well, isn't it? So would you suggest that this sort of profiling or character assassination that sometimes happens, or even just stereotyping should not be included at all? Or do you think that by ignoring that additional information, the stereotypes are just kind of taking overhand anyway?
So I think that presenting over and over in our 24-hour news cycle, the negative information over and over to potential jurors before they're even selected for a trial is the problem that we have. So, of course, character assassination happens in a court of law, and there are some laws that protect, and I'm going to provide a recommendation that I gave for laws that protect the victim. But yeah, I would say, like, it's really what happens before people even enter the courtroom that taints the story. And then more so over the larger implication of the court of public opinion, and then how people support particular policies, or so for instance, in the US, in some counties, the DA runs for elected office. So you could look at the track record of a particular district attorney and then determine if you want to vote for that person or have that person appointed. Like, in that feeling that you have towards the prosecutor or that district attorney is based on their record of convictions and this type of information that is used that then impacts the case. So it's wider than and bigger than just the one case, and it taints the entire system. Did that make sense, or did that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
So what this brings me back to actually is the case of Breonna Taylor, and I'm going to share with you some information about Breonna Taylor again. So we see the power that these representations have. So let's look at the information that was presented about Breonna Taylor once more. So I was interviewed by a local Louisville, Kentucky affiliate journalist for a story that eventually broadcast on All Things Considered on NPR about information that was being leaked about the Breonna Taylor case, and how that information might be impacting ultimately whatever decision was going to come from the DA, because we were pending a decision from the DA. In that week before, someone leaked info that Breonna Taylor was possibly a defendant or a potential defendant in a drug case involving her ex-boyfriend. And the question was, is this information being leaked right now to help justify her murder? Knowing that this is the key point in the court of public opinion, where the district attorney or prosecutor in the case would either get support for or backlash against whatever indictment recommendations he went for. Ultimately, and I'll show you a video of what happened in the case with Breonna Taylor, the decision was made not to indict any of the officers in her death. In fact, I'll go and play this video for you now that gives you a little information on what ultimately happened with the Breonna Taylor, or where Breonna Taylor case, or where we are now.
To be able to vote.
And I apologize for the commercial.
Because they're voting for
We're in an election.
A man that stands for righteousness and is fighting for the life of the unborn and for family values, and that they live in a country that the Constitution and the judges are in fact going to defend them. if we don't defend America today. We are not going to have that.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
Welcome back to CBS This Morning. We begin this half hour with our exclusive interview with two of the grand jurors in the Breonna Taylor case and their attorney, Kevin Glogauer. Taylor was shot and killed in her home during a police raid back in March. One of the officers at the scene, Brett Hankinson, was fired and charged with wanton endangerment for shooting at the apartment next door. No one was hurt there. But no officers have been charged for Taylor's death, and at least one of the officers involved has defended their actions. The jurors told us authorities never presented them with the option to consider indicting officers on more serious charges for Taylor's death, which left them feeling frustrated, disgusted, and even betrayed. Now, we're not revealing their identities at their request for their safety.
They didn't give us the charges up front when they gave us all of their testimony over 20-something hours, and then to say that these are the only charges that they're coming up with. It's like, well, what did we just sit through? And then to be told that we're not charging them with anything else, to me, it was a betrayal.
So when you all look, juror 1 and 2, and you're told that the only thing you need to consider right now is wanton endangerment, did anyone say, hey, are there any other options here? Did either of you say that?
Almost the entire room.
What was the answer that you were given?
Basically, in a nutshell, they said there were other possible charges that we considered, but nothing that we could make stick.
They never gave us the opportunity to deliberate on anything but the charges for Hankinson. That was it. As a matter of fact, when they announced that those were the only charges, it was an uproar in that room. There was several more charges that could have gone forward on all of those officers, or at least the 3 shooters.
Why is this so extraordinary, Kevin?
Normally, the grand jurors are presented with the law and the charges so that they can listen to the facts with an open mind and apply those facts to the law, almost as a roadmap.
What happened here?
What happened here was it was done in the complete reverse.
What stands out to you the most?
From a legal perspective, it looked like they weren't following the grand jurors, and they only wanted the grand jurors to follow them, which is contrary to the actual rule.
Grand juror number 1 and number 2 say what prompted them to ultimately speak out was that press conference held by Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron, which they insist falsely represented their position on potential indictments for the officers involved in Breonna Taylor's death.
While there are 6 possible homicide charges under Kentucky law, these charges are not applicable to the facts before us because our investigation showed, and the grand jury agreed, that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in the return of deadly fire.
When he stated that there were 6 possible murder charges and that the grand jury had agreed that those didn't apply, the first time I heard the word 6 possible murder charges was in that news conference.
It wasn't presented to you in the grand jury deliberations?
No. And personally, when I do something, I take responsibility for it. We had not done that.
I really felt that this was all Cameron. This was up to him. We didn't get a choice in that at all. So I was livid. By the time I heard what he was saying, everything that came out of his mouth, I was saying liar, because we didn't agree to anything. We never met Cameron.
You've never met Attorney General Cameron?
No, we never met him. He never discussed anything with us.
I think many people will be very surprised to hear that they had no contact with Attorney General Cameron whatsoever.
I agree. If you watch the press conference, it seemed clear from the wording that Mr. Cameron was implying that he played a larger role in the actual presentation.
Is that normally how it works?
Well, the Attorney General in Kentucky doesn't normally present cases to the grand jury. But I think to answer your question, Gail, generally the highest person in the office would at least come introduce themselves to the grand jurors.
Do either of you think there was enough evidence to present charges of murder, attempted murder, manslaughter?
Yes, I think there was. I mean, just all of the evidence there. As we were listening to it, we were sure this was leading up to something like that.
Among the evidence the grand jury heard from the night of the raid was a 911 call from Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. He says he fired a warning shot at who he thought were intruders. Officers returned fire with 32 bullets.
911 operator Harris, where is their emergency?
I don't know what happened. Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend.
The thing that stood out to me when I was talking to him, he said, "Why would I call 911 if I thought it was the police?"
That resonated with me because he didn't know who it was that was coming in. You know, he had no idea. You could hear the distress. Everything about what he said was believable. It made sense all the way through.
You found him credible?
Yes.
Totally believable.
Did you find the police credible?
No.
No, there are too many inconsistencies in their story. Now I understand that, you know, in a situation like that, you may not remember, but I didn't find their testimony credible.
What was your understanding about what happened that night?
It was a mess. It didn't seem to me that there was any organization or almost any leadership in the whole operation.
From the evidence that I heard, this thing started out downhill to begin with. You don't need 7 cops to go up to somebody's door and knock on it and say, you know, we're here to do an investigation at 1 o'clock in the morning. It kept going downhill from there. It was one mistake right after the other one, right after the other one. They covered it up. That's what the evidence that I saw. And I felt like there should have been lots more charges on that. They covered it up.
Now, later this morning, former Louisville officer Brett Hankinson is scheduled to be in court for a pretrial hearing on the wanton endangerment charges that he's facing. We did, by the way, reach out to Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron. He did not give us a new statement, but last month he did tell a local Fox affiliate if the jurors had wanted to make an assessment about different charges, they could have done that. The jurors, as you see, disagree with that.
They didn't get that aware of it. Yeah.
I mean, juror number 1 is white, juror number 2 is black, and it was juror number 1 who was so upset that reached out to attorney Kevin Glogauer because he said, "I don't know what to do with this. This is so frustrating."
Well, you can understand why they were livid at the attorney general's comments.
Yeah, they were being told that they went along with something that they clearly did not.
And that's what upset them. And it took them, they said, under 2 minutes to deliberate on the charges because all they had to consider were the wanton endangerment. We'll talk more with them at 8 o'clock about the toll that it's taking.
But you can obviously see, this is just 2 members of the grand jury, we should say, but they had a very different conclusion than.
But Anthony, I did ask, do you think other jurors feel this way? They said, look, we can't speak for other jurors, but there was an uproar in the room that everybody was unanimous in their anger about the decision.
But, well, we don't presume to speak for those other jurors either, but it's very clear these jurors were not represented in what the attorney general said.
Very interesting. Incredible interview.
So again, with the case of Breonna Taylor, when I sat down with the reporter, and this is obviously information that came out after the fact, when I sat down with the reporter and talked about Breonna Taylor's life and the way that she was talked about, what I said hurt me, upset me, angered me was there was no opportunity for Breonna Taylor's life to be celebrated in true honesty. That because we live in a society where the information that is received about a victim can then influence if anyone is brought to justice about their death, her family painted her in the most positive light possible when that wasn't even necessary, because if justice were really being served, we wouldn't be talking about Breonna Taylor's life beforehand. We will be talking about the actions that happened that night. And that even if we found out a slew of negative things about Breonna Taylor, that she was in fact a part of the things that she was accused of being a part of, we would be able to tell that part of the story also without it impacting actual justice for her. Because ultimately what happened in that apartment that night was just wrong from everything that we see in the information, positive or negative, outside of the parameters of that incident shouldn't matter, but that's not where we are. So some of the recommendations that my collaborator and I provided were, 1, for media to step up. So if you look at recommendations for ethical reporting, there is a nod towards being unbiased and not including extraneous information, but there is no mandate. In fact, that would be considered, you know, silencing the press, if you will. But our media has a responsibility to give us balanced information about victims in these cases and about the shooters. We need the balanced information and for the message to stay on target about the details of that night or the incident. And then the second part of this is, where is the justice for the victim? So in the US, there are some laws that protect sexual assault victims and the type of information that can be presented in court in defense of their perpetrators. So in California, for instance, there's a law that keeps you from removing the dignity of a victim. And by that, that means giving information about their previous sexual encounters or things that smear their reputation that research has shown impacts how justice is served. Well, why can't we have those same type of policies in these cases? At least in a sexual assault case, you have a victim for the most part that is alive and able to stand up for themselves. But in these cases, the reports that we get about victims after their deaths, there is no one there. There is no one in the courtroom other than their families to protect the dignity of their lived experience. So I'm going to just stop there because I've been talking for a while and open it up for discussion again. I know that there were some questions about design, I believe, in the chat box, so I can go back. Okay.
Yeah, if you want to go, you know, take those two, and then there were others who were messaging me privately that might ask the question now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the data on the interaction with race, I actually, in the paper that I showed you, I did not bring that chart out because you can imagine plotting the means of a 2x2x2 and getting at those interactions looks like a nightmare. But in the study itself, in the paper, there is a chart that gets into some of those three-way interactions, and you're able to see the race of victim, race of shooter interaction. And it's a really interesting thing that only happens in the case of white shooter, Black victim is where you see the movement. Let's see, was there a difference in ratings depending on the race of the participant? No. So we actually did some individual differences measures. We controlled for race of, and I could give you this complicated regression, but we controlled for race of participant and also their level of racism. So we use, I believe, the modern racism scale and then also the symbolic racism scale to get attitudes towards those items, and we did not see any impact on those individual differences. The other thing that we also looked at and controlled for was knowledge of and support for Black Lives Matter. So an additional study that I had done looked at attitudes towards Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name and All Lives Matter and people's support for those movements. And we did see some effect that people had a more negative response towards Black Lives Matter than they did Say Her Name, and that support was correlated with some other racial prejudice measures. So we wanted to control for that also. Did we consider a control group with no extra information about the victim? Yes. So the initial version of this study was a 3x3x3, where there was a control condition, a true control, where there was no information presented about the victim, and then also no information, no race information presented. I also have the effects before information was presented, that I can't remember why we chose not to report on it. I think it ended up just being so much stuff that ultimately that question of what happens if you release or remove the information wasn't as interesting to report on as the what happens when you layer the information on, but I do have those data.
And there was someone who just left, who left me a question in the personal chat, who was asking about the, sorry, I'm gonna go to be more accurate in, would be interesting to see the full cloud of these hundreds of people in each group, just to understand if there were ceiling and floor effects and whether those outliers have something in particular, if they're particularly special. I think this person is trying to think about people who will be in the extreme without, this person left and doesn't know that you had the racism scales and the attitudes, but I think it's just going towards that. Hopefully I'm being honest. No. And making justice to this question.
No, and I should have included that in the design, that we looked at demographic info, so race, gender of the participant, as well as their level of racial prejudice, support for Black Lives Matter, and some other things, and just didn't, the effects held, even controlling for that, so we didn't discuss it any further.
And then I have another one here that was asking whether, I have too many there, whether there were other previous or after your study that sort of push forward the questions in a different group. So like convergent evidence. Probably it is mentioning in your paper from the past ones, but has something happened in the last 2 years, 3 years that you think will change this type of study, or you have seen any new study similar to this one?
No, well, I know that the study's being cited, so somebody's doing something with it, but I don't know exactly. I have not kept up on what direction things are going. I would say, at least in the US context, that I would anticipate seeing stronger effects given the socio-political climate between 2016 and 2020 and where we are, that people are just more polarized than ever. I mean, I can throw in some terror management theory to layer on top of this, that COVID-19 and people's tendency to cling to their in-groups, to, deeply held values, to find a sense of certainty, would actually lead to more polarized reactions at this point. So people would be more likely, if I'm thinking through this, to cling to stereotype relevant information and things that are consistent with their worldviews.
Yeah. Before I keep on reading some of those that they were done personally, anybody wants to ask a question directly, don't be shy. Otherwise, I'll continue reading the ones I got sent personally. Kyle wants to answer his blue hand. Go ahead.
Go.
Hello. Sorry, I was trying to get the video on. Thank you for your talk, Professor Dukes. I appreciate it. I do have a question. You kind of talked about the media on this, and I'm from the United States, so I'm very aware of what the role the media plays as well. What you said you like to use your research for the applied stuff. What solutions have you sort of thought of, maybe in the policy realm, or you kind of talked about law as well, that could, kind of reel in the media on what they report? It's kind of a touchy subject because we get into regulation and all that, but I too agree that I think journalists and the media need to be held more accountable for what they say. So I'm curious if you've thought about, solutions to that macro level problem.
So, I mean, I think 2 ways. The first thing is, people as consumers of media, we can push the narrative. So they don't report these things just to report them. They report them because they get our attention. We have become a society of people that rely on really quick clips, that 30-second to 60-second, like, this is the story. And in order to bait people in, you need the juicy details. So as consumers of media, if we slowed down and were more nuanced in what we consumed and more critical in what we consumed, or even boycotted, if you will, media outlets that do these really unfair portrayals, it would change things because you follow the money. Like if we're boycotting a particular news agency, then that agency can't get advertising dollars and then that falls apart. So then they don't report on the biased crap, if you will, that they've done before. There's that way of controlling it. I don't think there are policies that we could really put into play. People would say we were silencing free speech and silencing the media, but that doesn't mean people can't be held accountable. So I'm all about the intent versus the impact. So you may have intended to tell a story that got the attention of the audience, but what was the impact of that story? So what if, families could levy civil suits based on representations that the media puts out there and how those representations then swayed juries or, the court of public opinion? What if? I mean, that's really hypothetical and it just gets into a nasty fight back and forth. So I'd rather it be from the consumer side, us, going on the attack, and then from the educational standpoint, journalists holding themselves more accountable in the way that they report. But yeah, from a policy angle, I don't think there's anything we can really do about free press.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Tom is next, and then Lee. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. So I wanted to ask about another possible layer to the problem here. I wonder if there's a threat of positive depictions of victims sometimes backfiring. So I'm thinking about, I saw a nasty meme go around from a right-wing group here in the UK saying that all these protests about George Floyd ignore the fact that he was a career criminal. So they're the kind of presenting this idea that it's almost like these positive depictions are propaganda and people are pulling the wool over our eyes. So you can imagine that as a response to all sorts of positive depictions of victims. These positive depictions can't be trusted, and actually they're probably far worse people than the media are letting on. So, I mean, I don't expect you to necessarily have an answer to this, but what can we do to kind of avoid that nasty backfire?
No, I mean, I agree. I think that is part of the damage that's been done with Breonna Taylor. Like, the way I describe it is she's now superhuman. She's not allowed to be human, even in her death. Like, no one had regard for your life, and therefore you were subhuman in the way that you were killed. And now in death, the justification of your life is making you into some superhuman character that you could never live up to. I don't think the solution is positive information about the victim either. I think the solution is stick to the information that is pertinent to the incident, because in both ways you're robbing that victim of humanity.
Good, thank you.
Hope I'm good to go next, Tristan. Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for a really great presentation. I wanted to ask actually something that you said really early on in relation to your career, that you'd got tenure, but you felt like the traditional academic pathway just wasn't, satisfying enough for you. And I was interested both in your reasons for why that is the case, but also more generally in terms of whether academia has a problem in sort of dividing people into, you're either a straight down the line academic or you're someone who does applied policy work, and you kind of have to force yourself to be one or the other, and that actually maybe we need more space for people to really sit in between. In relation to your own experience as well, I also wonder whether, you just had a personal sense that there were really big problems out there in the world that needed, something doing about, and that, in a way, there's a kind of privilege to being an academic who doesn't have to worry about that sort of thing, and just getting on, writing your papers, doing your thing, and not necessarily being concerned about addressing issues in the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite the fight that I deal with. I will start with my first fight was when I started my position at Simmons, not being at what was considered a top tier research university. So I went directly to my faculty position, ABD. I defended my dissertation at the end of my first year as a faculty member. And did not do a postdoc because a tenure track faculty position came my way and the market looked ugly. And my advisor was like, take whatever job you get. What is wrong with you? Like, why would you stick out and take a postdoc or do something else? Take this job that these people are offering you. But there was always this sense of I wasn't successful, that I wasn't living up to my potential in the way that people would talk to me. I even had someone say to me, why are you at that school? Why aren't you at a university with grad students? And why aren't you? Because I had this grant from the National Science Foundation. They're like, why are you wasting your time there? So there's always been this kind of feeling of, even my path that I chose was inferior because I did not go this straight line research, publish, R1 direction. And I think that as a field, we just need to have more room for people to like live their passion and their true success, and it not be caught up in the cloud of publications and where you're studying and grant money. The flip of that is me recognizing what type of privileged position I'm in. So in the US, the number of Black and Brown people that are dying from COVID-19 far exceeds that of white individuals in the US. And the people that are the frontline responders, and I'm not talking about the police and EMTs, I'm talking about the janitors and the nurses' aides and the people that are stocking grocery shelves that have to go into work are also people of color. And I recognize the privilege that I have to sit at home and work from home and talk about these big issues from kind of the ivory pedestal. So it's something that I fight and debate with a lot of the time. And the way that I reconcile it is there are brief opportunities where what I have to say and what I know about this work goes beyond the ivory tower. So every once in a while, there's an NPR article or, story where I can share these findings beyond and validate the experiences of Black women and people like me. So that's kind of how I try to balance it. Mm-hmm. But it continues to be a struggle. I don't think it's going away. And the question about, why I went admin, I had a mentor say to me the year before as I was going up for tenure that if you can't find the things that nourish you in the situation you're in, then you need to make a move. And I did a widespread, I knew I wanted to be a diversity officer at some point, and I looked for ways in which to get the training that I needed at my institution, and it wasn't there. So I had the difficult decision of, do I stay here and go through the hurdles of another 7 years before I go for full professor? Or do I just cut the string now and try something different? And I just jumped. I made the jump. And honestly, I got in too deep. Once I had on-campus interviews for some of these positions, I felt I was in too deep. There's no going back now. Take the job. So I did.
Lee, can I follow up on this one?
Sure.
So that's really for me. I mean, I've been discussing with some people who were at similar level or even more senior that got the professorship and then decided to go into something that was, I wouldn't call admin, but I would call more policy making. Although there's of course a lot of admin related to that. But you've been there in that post for a few years now, so you are in a unique position to tell us, is anything working? Because it's just it's because we know from the papers we publish that it's unlikely that this is going to make a change unless we also push that change. And of course, some papers become part of white papers and then become parts of policy. And we do consultancy. I'm sure Lee does a lot of that, mean less. But I'm in a unique position to ask you specifically the actions you take within, in the job. Do they make a difference? Can you measure that?
I think it makes a difference. The way I measure it is almost by recognition of the work that's in the arena of diversity, equity, and inclusion happening at Allegheny. So are there things that we're doing that can contribute to a cultural shift in higher education in general? So one of the programs that I worked really hard on starting here was a diversity teaching fellowship. And then we also have a diversity teaching cohort program. And the diversity teaching fellowship is particularly designed to bring in postdocs for a 2-year appointment and launch them into positions at liberal arts institutions. And I see that as one of those ways in which a policy that I created at my institution has the potential impact on all of higher ed, because we run in the same circles. Diversity officers are always talking to each other and trying to figure out, hey, what's the way to push this particular agenda? And if you see a model that works at one institution, then it spreads. So that's the way I see my impact. I see it in the lived experience of students. So if students leave the institution with a strong sense of belonging, with equity mindedness at the forefront and self-awareness, then they go out into the workforce and treat people in the workforce differently and look differently at the work that they're doing. So I can see the small impact. It's a ripple effect. And yes, those papers do matter, because because I'm a scientist at heart, and those are the data that I lean on to convince faculty and some administrators that the direction we're going is the right direction. I can point to them and say, this is the model, this is the mechanism, this is the way we implement this here, it'll work. And they listen to science.
Yeah, I like very much, because that was a follow-up of the discussion in which sense the type of evidence, like this particular paper, but any other type of evidence that are sort of also you would like to use to push a particular change in policy works. Because I've been asking this question in different places, different policy, and I'm very surprised the lack of direct effect, or the lack of direct line, right? I mean, maybe Barbara can also even chat about this, but the politicians or the policymakers who are in the government, they listen to taglines. They don't really look at the papers or even have usually discussion with consultants that are evidence-based consultants. That's my my experience interviewing people in this field. So I was wondering whether you had also that experience at the governmental level, if you've been in any panel, if you've been called, beyond the college or the professional, world.
Yeah, so I did a couple of policy briefs for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, SPISI. And SPISI has direct advocacy lines into the US government, so does APA. And there's like a speakers bureau, and every once in a while they'll come through and say, hey, we need you to give us expert information on blah, and you give them the tagline. But this is where we all become really important. So I taught research methods my entire time as a faculty member. And towards the end of being a faculty member, I decided that I didn't want my students writing papers anymore. I wanted them to write white papers and policy briefs, because my thinking was, we write these long, these 4, 5, 6, study papers that go into journals and are never touched again. But if I could teach my students how to present the information to this audience in a compelling way, then I was making a difference. So I shifted my focus in that way. And then, surprise, I decided I wanted to be an administrator. But I think that that's something that needs to happen throughout psychological science, that we need to teach those of us that are coming up, I used to talk about it in a war analogy, the people in the trenches, that we were in the trenches providing the good data so that the other soldiers could go forward and fight. Well, we need to teach our students how to provide better data. Like, make this in reasonable chunks so people can get it. Yeah, so that's my thinking. That's where we need to go as a science.
That's really great, actually. I see Lee sort of like.
Yeah, we've been thinking over the summer about reviewing curriculum in ways that help our students address these issues more. And that's not something we thought about, training them more in writing policy papers, translating evidence. That's a really great suggestion we can take up.
You see, one phrase and already making a change. Tagline into action. I love it. Any more questions or comments from the people in black screens? If not, I'll ask you a couple of things that were in my bucket list.
Okay.
So while you were presenting the say her name, I was thinking in Michelle Obama. Immediately it just came to mind whether having her and Obama in the White House make a change to that particular aspect, because I always, from my perspective, I always saw Michelle Obama as someone who's pushing policies that are a bit light, if you want, and I don't know if that's a normal thing. And I was wondering whether she had made a comment or made a change or created a change the fact she was there, or she made a is there a relationship? There's someone in such a high place at the US level. What's your thinking about it?
I never really thought through it. Now that I reflect on it, I'm thinking about like some pop culture things that started happening. So BET, which is Black Entertainment Television, once the Obamas were in office, I think they started this thing called Black Girls Rock. And then Black Girl Magic became kind of a hashtag. And so there are some ways in which having an African-American first lady brought Black women to the forefront. However, kind of like Breonna Taylor and how she did not get to be human, I feel like the same thing happened with Michelle Obama in the critique of her, especially very early on. I can remember there was a picture of her and she was sleeveless and people were making comments that her arms were too muscular. And then that turned into this whole critique on, gendered racism, that Black women aren't fully women. And I think that narrative kept her from being the person that she could have been. That even when she was outspoken and just firm, it was read as aggressive and as a stereotypical representation of Black women. So for those people who were enlightened and empowered by her, yes, but for those folks that were looking for evidence to support the stereotypes they already had, nothing happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll call you, if Biden Harris win.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you what you think later.
I mean, even just after the vice presidential debate and the conversations about Kamala Harris and how she was able to navigate so eloquently the balance between, being assertive and not being read as an angry Black woman. Like the fact that is the conversation people were having and not a recognition of the historical moment of a main party vice presidential candidate being a Black woman. That wasn't even the conversation. No one was even talking about that. We're talking about the fly on Mike Pence's head and, did Kamala come across as likable? Well, it's the same competence buying, warmth buying that we saw Hillary Clinton in. Like, you don't get to be fully a leader as a woman or a person of color in this country.
Yeah. Any more questions Guys, we are reaching the border of the hour and a half of the Zangwill as usual. I'm very happy that sort of went well.
Appreciate the people that hung on.
Yeah, I mean it's normal. You get the tail, and then I tweet about it, and then you start to get questions. You should reactivate your Twitter account because I'm sure you're gonna get a lot of those.
Okay. My Twitter account that I don't touch at all.
Yeah. Even the Department of Psychology already sort of tag you there. And I was going to say, well, I don't think she uses it, but I'll tell her in the talk. Good. I see the people are telling me in private that they have to go, but great talk. So I'll if you can join me in actual real applause, I'll be happy.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
No, it was great, and reactivate the Twitter, and I'm gonna make a second wave. Sorry for the comment splash about it when I post the link of the talk. I'll send you a link first, and you can revise it, and if you agree, then I'll put it up.
You don't need to send it to me. I won't look at it anyway. Just do what you're gonna do.
Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Oh, I'm happy that it was useful.
I think that's the type of talk we need for the Friday also, that it has the geeky part there. Also having in your face, you're going to watch the video and understand the specific situation, because otherwise we get into this sort of very dry argumentation without understanding the context. So you're the second one who actually takes that much more human, not only academic approach. The first talk was also like that. I'm really happy that it's happening. I don't take a lot of credit. I take the credit for inviting people. I think they give a good talk, but hopefully we'll continue. And we have now 2 people doing institutional racism in academia and in psychiatry and psychology in the UK. And those were the people who said first, I'm just gonna ask you this because it was more related to the, what does it mean?